I'm Elizabeth Hinton, professor of history, African American studies, and law at Yale University. When the racial reckoning, as so many have called it, of 2020 happened following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, a lot of people were asking questions about how we reached this point and, where this police brutality was coming from, where the protests were coming from, even though the vast majority, or about 96% of the protests during the summer of 2020 were completely peaceful and nonviolent. In some cities like Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Detroit, and elsewhere, we did see some violence. We saw property destruction. We saw fighting between police officers and civilians. And people wanted to know how we got here. And these kinds of clashes have a much, much, much longer history that stretches back to the civil rights period. In the years between 1964, when Harlem erupted after a New York City Police Department officer shot and killed a black high school student named James Powell, through the early 1970s, there were frequent clashes between low-income black communities and police officers, right? And these riots, as they were often called then, were very, very much rooted in the same demands as the mainstream civil rights movement. They were about access to educational opportunities and housing and jobs, and to essentially be fully included in American society as full political and economic citizens. With this more violent form of protest that we see emerging during the second half of the 1960s, it was very often caused by an incident between police and members of the community. And despite the fact that this form of protest was very much rooted in civil rights grievances, immediately policymakers criminalized that protest. They called it a riot, and they responded not with the things that residents were demanding, but with more police, which was the kind of source of the problem in the first place. So in my book, America on Fire, I really look at the kind of long history of these incidents. That they peaked between 1968 and 1972, when about 2,000 cities erupted, and not just big cities like Watts, Los Angeles, and Detroit, and Newark, and Washington, D.C., but smaller places like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Carver Ranches, Florida, and Cairo, Illinois, and Stockton, California. They happened all over the country in the era of the war on crime. That is when the federal government began, after 1965, investing in local police forces and expanding those forces and militarizing those forces with surplus technologies from Vietnam. And part of this militarization effort was an attempt to stamp off or to prevent future so-called rioting. One of the things that I want to do in the book is to break this continued cycle, because while this kind of violence peaked in the 1960s, it's still very much with us, as we saw in 2020, and it's going to continue to be a problem in American life until we can solve the root causes of the problem. One of the things that I talk about in America on Fire is the cycle that we've seen unfolding again and again between police violence and community violence. As I mentioned, it's almost always an incident of police brutality or aggressive police contact that leads to these violent eruptions in communities that are being heavily policed, often with militarized police forces. And so much of this cycle is rooted in how we conceive of this violence and the policy responses that we use. So one of the key things in the book is to not label this form of political violence as rioting, but to think of it as a rebellion. In labeling this violence as rioting, it then becomes criminal, it becomes meaningless, and the political motivations, again rooted in these larger socioeconomic inequalities, get completely obscured. And so the solution then becomes more police, more surveillance, more incarceration, which now, after a half a century of these punitive policies, have clearly not solved the problem. So now we need to begin to think about what different kinds of solutions might be out there. And that's part of why it's important to really understand this form of violence in the complexity that it represents. And we've known what the solutions are for some time. In 1968, as Detroit was burning, President Lyndon Johnson called for a commission on the causes and prevention of violence. And this commission, known as the Kerner Commission, studied all of the so-called riots that were ongoing in American cities and recommended solutions to prevent future rioting. And what the Kerner Commission said, and this was, a pretty moderate group of people representing political and social welfare circles, essentially said, if we want to address the root causes of this violence, we need to go well beyond the war on poverty. We need to go well beyond job training programs and remedial education programs, and we need to mobilize the public and private sectors to invest in communities with high rates of unemployment and failing public schools and subpar housing. We need to invest in those communities. We need to provide jobs for people. We need to provide decent housing for people, and we need to expand educational opportunities for people. Unfortunately, we didn't get the massive structural transformation that the Kerner Commission advocated, and we've been dealing with the consequences of that policy decision ever since. Instead of investing in social welfare programs, the federal government decided to invest in more policing and invest in expanding the prison system. So history here is a really, really key weapon to understand how we got to the point where we get a George Floyd and a Breonna Taylor, and also how then we can prevent continued murders, continued tensions between police and communities in the future. And we've known for some time what the solutions are, and now it's about building the political will and mobilizing to actually bring them to fruition, which will allow us to finally realize the founding principles and values of this country.